Aloha and welcome to another episode of Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin, and today we're talking about people, place, and possibility, community-based economic development. We're joined by Brent Kakesako, the Executive Director of the Hawaii Alliance for Community-Based Economic Development. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And so in this sort of landscape of community development processes everywhere from sort of the more commonly known sort of developer building land and whatnot to economic development through foreign direct investment to sort of grassroots community organization, it seems to me that HACBED has played this interesting role through the years of working with community groups to sort of lift up their processes. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit more about HACBED and what it is and how you got involved with it.
Sure. So HACBED was loosely formed in response to a lot of what you were talking about, a lot of the development that was happening in the 70s and 80s. So a number of community practitioners were looking for a space where they could voice what they felt was important or what development looked like from their point of view. So HACBED was kind of was born out of that. So became an official organization in 1992. Led by its founding director, Bob Agris, and a number of prominent community members, the Rapoons, Colette Machado, a number of other individuals. And was really a space to really think about what does economic development mean for us, and use the term community-based economic development, kind of a term that lifts up that economic development should come from local communities where they have essentially choice and control over their lives to push towards a life that makes sense for them. And we've been terming it like their pursuit for genuine wealth. So it's kind of the history. I was fortunate to come on a few years back. It's actually a funny story. Well, I guess before I hit the funny story, so a lot of the work HACBED does is very relationship-based. And so rightly so, as the transition was happening from Bob, people were, a lot of the board at the time was worried that whether HACBED could transition to someone new. Rightly so, Bob and the staff at the time really built strong relationships, a lot of trust in the community. So Bob was wanting to transition, though, realizing that he was being called elsewhere. But part of that, the funny part, though, is so he said, oh, yeah, you know, through a very rigorous hiring process. No, not really, but it should have been more rigorous, probably. But basically, he told me, like, I had the job, and I was, at the time, in law school, so I was out of the transition process, which was good. But it got told publicly at a symposium in 2012 that Bob was retiring and HACBED was shutting down. And that was public, so I was like, oh. And I looked at Bob like, what the heck? And he's like, oh, don't worry about it.
So your introduction to working with the organization was, this organization is now yours and now shuttered.
Basically.
Lead it.
Yeah, so I was, luckily I was on staff part-time, so people had kind of knew who I was. So a lot of when I came on board was, are people too tied to the original staff and board and the individuals that the entity should be shut down? So I was fortunate to not have that emotional tie to the entity, which is in a way just a structure, because the work there will always be a need, I think, or hopefully not, but you know, there is a need and it doesn't have to be tied to an organization. So when I first came on, it was really talking story to people and asking, is there still a space for HACBED? And there was a resounding yes by a lot of our partners. And then my second question was, can you see someone else leading it? You know, in particular, in this case, me, and if not, is anybody. And so the way we lasted through the transition, or are lasting through this transitional period, is all of our partners said yes and took a leap of faith to work with the team we have now. And so that's kind of where we're at. We were able to get kind of in a more stable place since then and begin to look forward. So that's kind of.
So you made mention of this need. what do you see as the thing that HACBED addresses?
That's a good question. So a lot of our role is, we feel, so our mission is to support families and communities where they're at, to build their capacity so that they have choice and control to push at social, economic, and environmental justice. So what that means is we believe that families know and can do things on their own, and they know what they want. It's just they need help navigating some of the structures and systems that are in place now to get there. So in a nutshell, our role is to help them navigate that, support them where they're at in whatever it might be. Often being a connector, a facilitator, and a weaver, and often a translator. Communities are saying, and families are saying, we want this, but funders are talking in certain types of language. So figuring out how do we translate to what they're saying to get support and also hopefully push the conversation.
So in a sense, like acting as a bridging organization between the needs identified by the various communities and potentials for partnerships with other entities, or even for funders, and helping modify, or not necessarily modify, but I guess translate, as you termed it, their understanding of the issues and the solutions into verbiage that is grant speak.
Yeah.
So so before you got involved with this, you mentioned law school. I mean, how did you come to this type of grassroots work? Because it sounds like this is very much working, not to say from the bottom up, but it's not policy driven. It's not about the delivery of services from on high.
I guess you could say I tripped, stumbled, and fell. So I was fortunate to be living abroad in Japan when a lot of the financial crisis type things started happening, and hearing family and friends struggle, and friends in my age group saying, like, we got all this education, but we're starting at the bottom. We have to work our way up. We're in these jobs we hate, dead-end jobs, or we don't have these opportunities that we thought we would. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, I think, is a structural thing. So I was all motivated to come back home to Hawaii, where I grew up, to try to figure out what that meant and how I could help. So I worked a little bit for the city and county, didn't quite fit there, and in my free time was doing some volunteer organizing and whatnot, just little events for nonprofits, and feeling really good about it, really excited, but then realizing that it was a feel-good, and it wasn't really addressing deeper issues, and recognizing there were a lot of legal issues and things involved, and so that's what motivated me to go to law school, to understand kind of what's going on and be able to navigate. And then during the time at school, I was introduced by friends to HACBED and started volunteering there, doing my research for a law school paper on community-based economic development. It turned out I didn't really realize that's what it was. And then through that, built relationships. And again, Bob took a chance, a leap of faith, because given my track record at the time, I, on paper, probably shouldn't have been running, or even now, maybe not, shouldn't be running an organization. So very grateful to the people who have helped.
So sort of a trial by fire. I mean, there was this legacy of this entity of 2 decades plus even of operations and building relationships, which, as you highlighted, is very critical in this process of, if there isn't an established trust between a support entity and a community about the capacity of that entity to really bring people up from in a manner that they want and lead them towards the futures that they're identifying, then you can't be effective in that sort of community-based role.
Yeah.
I found myself interested in had heard about HACBED a little bit over the years from various friends and peers and whatnot. We're like, oh, I'm working with HACBED, or I used to work there, and so it seems like there's been this kind of, I don't want to say labile, but like not transient, but it's been a place that a lot of different community organizers and people that are doing great work all around the state have been involved with for quite some time. And I'm actually now lucky to be among the ranks in a strange twist of nepotism. I'd actually tried to get you on this show sometime before, and
Yeah.
subsequently have since started working for HACBED, which has been,
It's a good
I
play.
can attest,
It's a good play.
good place. And so it's a little interesting dynamic in this setting, but yeah. So I mean, what are the sort of, how do you initiate these roles? I mean, what is it? Somebody just calls you up and says, "Hi, we're community. We'd like this future. What do you do?" Or
Yes.
how does it get?
So for a long time, we've been really lucky that it's kind of word of mouth, and probably how we want to keep it. We don't really want to advertise. So it's a lot of like, oh, this person told me to call you because you did this for them. They don't really know what you do, but they said I should call you. And so usually that's how it happens. And we'll just take time to sit down for an hour or two, or sometimes 3, just to talk story and see what's really going on, what do they need help with, are we actually the right place? And if not, we have partners or people we know who can handle different parts. So usually how we do it, and I think that's kind of how we've been able to sustain and whatnot. Just quickly going back to what you're saying, I think having all those people in different places, like you're saying, has been what has helped to sustain us. And Bob had kind of that inherent understanding that by doing that, whether it's making time for people or building the capacity of different people, despite them maybe not despite, but even if like their space wasn't HACBED, but they knew what HACBED was about, and that's kind of, I think,
how it's been able to sustain itself. I mean, one of the interesting things that I sort of learned, having come on board fairly recently, was that, you know, there is sort of this open door policy, and what you would phrase as, you know, we'll meet with anybody once to help, or just to be an ear, and a sort of a backboard against which ideas can be chucked and responded to. And I think that's a really powerful space, because in a lot of these you know, sort of very complex systems of community organization just from within a community, and then as it starts interacting with policy and zoning and legal issues, there's so many layers of, not to say bureaucracy, but just the considerable organization that goes into having a complex society, that it's difficult for any single entity to have a you know, an awareness or particularly a fluidity at all of these very various scales. And so it seems like HACBED is doing a pretty good job of helping translate in various realms, and within a bounded spectrum, the various sort of confusion of these various you know, different.
And it's partly too, for us, it's not totally altruistic. We get a lot of fun, and we learn a lot from the people on a personal level that come in with different ideas or different backgrounds. And so for us, it's always just an ongoing learning, and in the process of trying to stay open and learn, it's, oh, okay, that clicks with something kind of vague, may not seem connected, but it might be this way, and trying to connect the dots that way, I think, is some of the value we hope to add, but also on a more tangible level, like listening, synthesizing the notes we take in the meeting and sending it back to the person or the group, in hopes that at least that little bit is of value now.
All right. Well, we hope this has been of value. We're going to take a quick break. Join us back after these messages.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I host Likeable Science on Think Tech Hawaii, and I do this because I care about science literacy in Hawaii. I want to spread the understanding that science is a vital and interesting part of everyone's life. I want to make sure the broadest possible spectrum of people understand the beauty and the value of science and realize that science plays out each and every day of their lives. I want you to understand that science is fun. So we bring onto this show each week guests who are scientists, from astronomers to zoologists, and we talk about what they do and how they do it. But most importantly, we talk about why you should care about their work, why you should see that their work has value and impact on your life. So I hope you'll join us Fridays, 1 p.m. here on Think Tech Hawaii. You can watch us via live stream. You can watch us recorded on Olelo, and you can see us each week. We hope you'll join us.
All right, aloha and welcome back to Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin. Today we're talking about people, place, and possibility in community-based economic development. We're joined by Brent Kakesako, the Executive Director of the Hawaii Alliance for Community-Based Economic Development. You were just filling us in on a little bit of sort of your history and background, and sort of the way that HACBED approaches this work. And as I think you alluded to, it sort of gets muddled in a lot of different words and concepts and whatnot. So to bring it down into actual projects, I mean, what are the types of things that HACBED is involved with at this point?
So one thing that kind of would help capture maybe the way we work in a very amorphous sphere is how we help to facilitate the whole Vai network. So this actually had a bunch of different ways it came about, but started with, especially on Hawaii Island, with an asset policy roadmap that the County of Hawaii wanted to support. And basically what that was capturing what families are seeing in terms of what's working well, what are some of the challenges they're seeing, and what's one thing they wish they could change. And we're fortunate to be able to work statewide, collect those stories, and then synthesize the themes and figure out now what's really going on, like what are structural things, what are policy and things like that. And in the process of doing that, we helped to get a lot of people excited and kind of organically led to creating a network. And the whole Vai came about.
So whole Vai being sort of Vai, for steadfast viewers who will know from previous shows, that sort of Vai is water, Vai is sort of
Choke
wealth,
water.
Plenty water, and then that being sort of a corollary into wealth. And so whole Vai would be sort of like to build wealth, to bring that into fruition.
Yeah, because basically I think what I understand from the practitioners who talk to us, it's when a community has water, they're wealthy because they can take care of themselves. Mm-hmm. They're self-sufficient. So this network kind of, and I use Hawaii Island as an example, but this was attempted statewide. But because of the difficulty in sustaining the kind of that network loose approach, it really took off in Hawaii Island because of, I think, the way many of the residents approach this type of work. Mm. And so what it's kind of morphed into is like a really focused group of individuals, service providers, government officials, and community members who are, I guess, exploring how to better deliver holistic financial empowerment services. So that financial empowerment word is, again, grant speak, but it's how do you basically help families achieve genuine wealth. And so what the network does is meet monthly, and we help to facilitate and connect their programs, take time out of their busy schedule to kind of think on the bigger issues that we're all trying to reach towards, which is helping our families on the Hawaii Island achieve genuine wealth, whether it's through housing, whether it's through financial literacy. But then how do we better partner to do that, to leverage resources? And we have county officials at the table. How do we help them rethink the way they kind of deliver their ask for RFPs, maybe modify some of their housing contracts, things like that, in a way that builds, like supports families more holistically, but also in a way also supports the providers that are doing these things, and so that way it's a mutually beneficial type.
So that's a very diverse suite of organizations, I mean, that you just listed. You're talking about county programming and officials, you're talking about community groups, you're talking about sort of third sector, nonprofit support entities, and trying to sort of meld each of these into a cohesive network of support. Mm-hmm. I found something interesting sort of in some of the dialogue about HACBED is that sort of viewing economic development as a mechanism or as a means to achieve social, economic, and environmental justice, mm-hmm. which I think is a sort of an interesting phrasing. Like, because often, it's sort of a chicken or the egg question. Is like if your housing is solid, are you then able to get a job, or vice versa? So we're looking sort of with housing first here, but looking at that economic development portion as a mechanism, and not that it's all focused on making money by any stretch, but that it often gives more access or more capacity I think a good example from sort of the food perspective is, if you were dropped anywhere in the world, would you be starving? And the answer is probably not, because you can afford those, you can afford to buy food because of our globalized distribution system. And so sort of local, bringing that back home would be that, through economic development, through jobs and access and whatnot, education, that we can address these injustices, and this whole suite of injustices through that lens. And pretty powerful framework.
Yeah, I mean, and what's cool is it's coming from this network, these organizations involved. What we try to do again is support and facilitate, help make connections. A lot of them, because of the frame they're coming from, only know it from that frame. So helping them, again, in a way, translate even in between individual organizations to be like, I think you guys are talking about the same thing. Maybe they're just approaching it through the housing lens or through the workforce lens, but that entry point is still the entry point to that broader genuine wealth or that broader support.
And that whole process being essentially working with people in the place that they are to achieve the possibilities that they're seeking.
Yeah.
So that's HACBED. What other projects? I mean, so that's sort of a network scale. What are the other types of interaction that HACBED has with entities?
Sure. So I guess on a network scale that also drills down to the individual entity would be, so again, working with the Office for Social Ministry, the social justice arm of the Catholic Diocese, and they're looking at how do we support our parishes, 66 across the state, to better engage in this idea of food justice. And a lot of them are doing emergency food type things like food pantries, food shelter, homeless shelters that have food attached to it. How do we be a part of that sustainable, nutritious conversation? And so obviously a huge thing for them to tackle and for us to support. So for example, that has embodied is convening on a larger scale parishes to talk about this, but then helping on an individual level with parishes that have existing food ministries or food activities, and then helping them to grow those. So for example, St. Damien on Molokai, they had a backpack program already where they're feeding children in elementary school in the sense of a lot of them were coming hungry. So they worked with school officials to identify these kids and give them a backpack to take home.
A backpack
of food, sorry.
Full of food, yeah.
Yeah. And then from that, they're starting to branch into maybe how do they incorporate that into their youth ministry? How do they better engage with community members and community organizations to bring in resources? So be, I guess, an anchor institution in that way. So that's kind of how a large network scale or a broader initiative can be drilled down on a more individual.
And so it sounds like, I mean, this is sort of a contrast in bit between, I want to say like an aid model versus, say, an empowerment model, right? Where it's like that, give a man a fish, teach a man to fish.
Yeah.
Have a food pantry so that when you're hard up, this is where you can go, which the safety nets, particularly in light of our increasing cuts in our actual social safety nets from a societal perspective are increasingly important, but that's not that ideally the way that we frame this, food justice perspective should not be just a handout as the sole mechanism of addressing those issues. And so trying to develop that into a broader sort of perspective that then engages a variety of different community entities to support.
Yeah, so for example, across the board, a lot of parishioners have been doing things in their parish. Like, for example, a lot of food pantry volunteers have been there for 10, 20 years. So it's that fine line of we're mahaloing what they've done, but also recognizing what else can be done. And so partly on the individual parish level, it's talking story with these people, what are the needs, what are the opportunities, and then who can we bring in from the community surrounding area that can help them take it to the next level, and also in the process attracting new people to often take on these new things rather than asking these existing volunteers to take on more. But again, it's a lot of the relationship management, or I guess relationship, being mindful of those types of things.
So that's it. I mean, I think you phrase it in an interesting way. It's like you're working with this perspective of meeting people where they're at various scales, right? So it's meeting essentially in this instance, the broader community that's being supported by this social ministry, this food ministry.
Yeah.
Sort of working with that ministry to better address or to increase how they address that need, that latent need, but then also meeting the food ministry itself in terms of where they're at, and not trying to say, well, you could do more, so let's just pile all these things on. But looking at sort of bridging and including other potential partners in the discussion to sort of build this, I guess, network of sort.
Yeah, and it's also so they feel supported, but they also see, in this case, this entity, it's connecting with what they do, like obviously their faith with community work. A lot of times, and in this case, the parish or the church is not the only entity that sees this, but a lot of times our interests are siloed. So it's how do we see the connection so that when we're doing something in community, or in this case, when we do something in our church, there is a connection, and that it's not, oh, I have this hat and that hat, and there's no...
Never the twain shall meet.
Yeah. So, and that's actually been a big thing, and not just, again, in this work, in a lot of work, like, many people are already doing something, but they see it in a certain light. So it's how do you meet them where they're at, acknowledge that, but then maybe help them to connect it to something else, and hopefully something broader. And that's where, like, the movement building, bringing in other partners who can help broaden that conversation helps.
So both of those, HACBED and the Office of Social Ministry work, sounds like it's really a network development, which is a pretty broad mechanism of interaction. What other ways do you work with entities? I mean, do they have to join some network? Does it have to be some big thing, or how else do you interact?
Yeah, so we also do things like on an organizational level, where we, for example, we're working with a group out in Halava Valley on Oahu. They're basically a family who's caretaking parts of the valley. And so the group was founded by kind of the generation that was protesting the construction of the H3. Obviously, it still got constructed, so they keep on caretaking the valley, but their generation is starting to pass away. So they're trying to hand it off to not even the next generation, the generation after, their grandchildren. So the way we got involved is by them asking, how do we do this? So over the years, it's been informal at first, but helping them to build their organizational capacity, the systems they need, like financing, accounting, writing grants, HR, helping them create an entity and have it run on its own, but then building the capacity of the people involved so that they could do that. So that's how we help on an individual level, and we kind of do it on a shared risk type of mentality. A lot of it at first was for no pay, if you will, but it's building that relationship, understanding what they need and what they want, and then going after shared grants. So we're able to secure one recently, so we've been able to fund both of us in the process. And it's been an interesting one because, again, it's a family, so it's a lot of emotion, a lot of connection, but then maybe not what the grandchildren actually want. They understand the importance, but they have their own interests, so it's now how do you navigate that? Is there a way to bring in other people? And if not, then how do you help the family, like, kind of scale back their expectations? And so a lot of different things to juggle, but it's a way we help on a specific organizational type level.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of this is involved with really just navigating relationships and expectations of others, of managing the expectations of others that others have of HACBED, and also helping manage internal expectations both for HACBED and then with the entities that you're working with.
Definitely. A lot of people contact, but like, oh, I heard you fund organizations, or I heard you do this or that, and it's Maybe I don't.
Not exactly no, and
Yeah.
not exactly yes.
So then it's more like, what do you need? What are you looking for? And then we can figure out our role, and then move forward from there, or like again pass you to another an entity who can help you meet your near-term needs.
All right, cool. We're going to pass you to these messages where you can meet your near-term needs.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to Think Tech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the Think Tech Hawaii broadcast network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
All right, aloha and welcome back to Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin. Today we're talking about people, place, and possibility in community-based economic development. We're joined by Brent Kakesako, the Executive Director of the Hawaii Alliance for Community-Based Economic Development. You were just telling us about some of the various entities that HACBED's been working with, sort of network programming. You mentioned earlier this phrase, choice and control. Mm-hmm. So in terms of like a process of how HACBED or you, and even in particular, approach community-based economic development, what does that choice and control mean?
It's a good question. I don't, and I guess that hits the crux of how HACBED works, and how I feel my personal role is. So I'm a fourth generation Japanese American, so have roots here, but still recognize, no matter what way you look at it, that my family is part of that colonizing type story. So how does, and I'm not the only one, so what is our role in the story of Hawaii moving forward? How do we contribute, but despite or with that story and that history in mind? And so I guess for me, it's how do you, and for HACBED, how do you support what a community wants in terms of, in this case, economic development, but how do we create opportunities where they do have true choice and control to figure out how they want to live, how they want to earn, in this case, earn money or whatever it might be. And I think that's our vision, I guess, for community-based economic development. The way we kind of have, in a way, translated it for the way we work. Mm-hmm. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It is messy, it is fun, but it's like, takes time, and it's mm-hmm. not gonna be like, here's a plan, this is it. It's like, here's a loose plan, and it often just goes off. But creating, like you're saying, processes to check in and keep circling back, keep iterating, and keep moving, not necessarily forward, just, moving in a way that feels comfortable or safe makes sense for the community that we work with. So a lot of times that means there's no quote unquote progress or movement, but in a way that is progress, because giving space for community members to reflect on, is this really what we want? Mm-hmm. And then that way they can move forward.
Which is a very, very different approach to economic development. I mean, when considering sort of like different planning processes or institutionalized approaches to, alleviating poverty or addressing livelihood issues. I mean, it's very often like that that everybody's going to have a job and everybody's going to have, X, Y, or Z form of future mm-hmm. that is writ initially, and then it's just how do you keep pushing towards that, which is in stark contrast to, I feel, how HACBED works. And we were on the Big Island working in Ka'u,
Yeehaw.
and there was an interesting one of the community members made an interesting comment. They're like, what if we don't want jobs, we just want to fish? And you know, and that for a lot of other development or community support entities, that's not like an acceptable answer. That is like, well, you need this and you need that, and it's a prescriptive process as opposed to really, I mean, putting in the time to tease out and to build the relationships so that the truly felt and like auto-identified problems that a community is facing and solutions that they see going forward can really be supported and malamed into reality. So
Definitely.
From your perspective, I mean, what do you see like HACBED? Is it evolving into something? I mean, this is sort of in a contrast, right? So like, is it moving somewhere, or is that sort of same approach reflected in the way that it is currently? I mean, it's not like, do you see an exponential growth and multiple offices around the state, or is it like the takeover, yeah, the passive takeover?
For us, I mean, that's an awesome question, because that's exactly where we're at, trying to figure out now that we're in a relatively stable place, what does that mean for us moving forward? So we've been kind of articulating, you know, there's all this talk about co-learning spaces and these types of hubs and whatnot. So how can we be more of a, co-working spaces? But so we're trying to be more of a co-learning space where people kind of understand our values are that support, that capacity building. But how do we then engage others, understand our approach, but have this broader socioeconomic environmental justice vision in mind? And then how do we help them, let them know we're out there so that we can pull in projects and work collaboratively. But then also be mindful of the financial and economic realities that they need to make a living wage, and how do we account for that? And so a lot of it is being flexible on hours and things like that. And obviously with the idea again to continually have these tough conversations. So things that come to mind for us that hit home is like the development happening in Kakako, where there's things just happening with that feels like just without much community input or very little, and it's a little bit frightening. And a lot of these condos are going to be owned by people who don't live here and who really have no major investment because they're living here periodically.
Other than financial.
Yeah, and so what does that mean? How does that going to change? How do we ask entities who do have roots here, like commitment schools or others, to somehow build in a way where you're acknowledging the people who are here, and again balancing what their financial goals and whatnot, and these people that they're allowing to live and whatnot. So that's like one example that comes to mind. Another is like on Lanai, we're supporting some community-based organizations. But again, it's an island owned by one person, basically. What does that mean for the people who live there? Or in a way, in the capitalist mindset, are squatting because they don't really own their land. But it's a really tough issue to address and a tough thing for them to talk about, because it's very, like you're mentioning earlier, like it's not an empowering situation, very disempowering. Like what are we supposed to do? And so these are kind of the issues where we would hope to support, but also in supporting, maybe just be a place to have these tougher discussions about what does that mean for us as people who are living here and growing up here and things like that.
So I mean, it sounds like you sort of transitioned already into my next question to some degree. Is that like, so with that sort of that future as you imagine it for HACBED, how does that translate into sort of what you see as a sustainable Hawaii, or when is your job done? What does that social environmental landscape look like?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
It would probably be one where, to get very broad, it's people doing what they want to do and love. I mean, this is very cliche, and are and are happy doing it. So, for example, the person you brought up in Ka'u, they're fishing and and people are okay with that. It's not like, why are you so lazy, or whatever the stigma might be.
Mm-hmm.
There's space in our society where these alternative, not really alternative, but these different ways of living are
Contrasting
acceptable.
models.
And not only accepted, but respected. And it's a really interesting conversation, especially here in urban Honolulu, where it is a little more, I guess, capitalized or capitalistic. So what does that mean? How do we navigate that? But a lot of, so I guess, the ideal, to answer your question more directly, would be like having that acceptance or acknowledgement, but also that being a true path that future generations can seriously consider, like maybe not just going to college or other things.
I think it's really interesting, man. As you're saying that, what comes to mind for me is that whether it's at a policy level, at a planning level, or even at this grassroots level, it's really about navigating this competition of interests, and not necessarily competition, but it's really about how do you facilitate discussions or law or whatnot that is allowing the greatest number to have the greatest outcomes as on their terms.
Yeah.
And I think where that phrase sort of differs even at the grassroots level is that it's not just about the greatest number, it's also about who's being left out of that conversation, and how do you work to bring them into those discussions and bring their idealized futures and their goals into this broader discussion through like that translation.
Yeah, definitely. What would be powerful, like I guess a tangible thing is having, for example, community processes that aren't just like the town hall type meeting. Right? You have processes that take into account small group. There's space and time to have these different kinds of discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe allowing people to express themselves in different ways, music, dance, art, whatever. But that being accepted as like, oh, that's a way people are commenting on this, I guess in a way, a project or something. So at least that way, kind of broadening that discussion, and like you said, these other ways of including people, and doing so in a way that as many voices in different ways are heard, and it's not just the same voices saying the same things, really loudly, that get acknowledged.
Well, and I think you mentioned time, and one thing that has been really stark for me as I've begun working with HACBED is that there is very much a different kind of relationship with time than I found with other entities, or even with my own entities. Like that there's a lot more. There is a steadfast willingness to invest time into process, into the relationship development, into getting to know somebody before the discussion happens, and that approach is just so different from come to this one feedback meeting and then here's your plan, on to the next bid. And I think part of it, as I see it, is that as we're sort of seeking or looking to try and envision this alternative future, or this collaborative future, is that I imagine it sort of as a mosaic of strong communities that have gone through this process of auto-identifying and creating the entities and the support networks that help them do for themselves, and not at the cost of what other communities want, or the cost of their own environments or whatever else, but that it really, as I imagine it, is this sort of, there's just this mosaic of strong, healthy, and vibrant communities living, working, and loving on their own accord.
Boom.
Boom. There you go. So what's a good way? If people are interested, or if it sounds like hey, I'm a community organization or person or whatnot with these types of things, what's a good way to interact, or what sort of suggestions would you have for folks as a?
I guess, well, definitely reach out to us. We'd be down to, again, like you've mentioned, talk story to anyone, and at least share more of what we do, and also how they can directly get involved in some of the work. But I guess a simple way is to just talk story. Like, go home, talk to your people you look up to or your kupuna and listen to their story and see what they experience and see how that, and try to stay open in a way to see how that applies to your daily life. I think have a beer with someone. Take it easy.
Well, thank you for coming in and talking story with us today.
No, thank you.
Much appreciated. And so once again, Brent Kakesako, Executive Director of the Hawaii Alliance for Community-Based Economic Development. And I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin. Join us here every Thursday for Sustainable Hawaii, the show about making the transition from being individual consumers with rights to building communities of producers with responsibilities. Aloha.
Chihu.